Hello, I'm Nikhil.
And I'm Shankar. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 32, Education and Career Choices.
Shankar, how are you today?
Hey, I'm great. Really pumped up to talk about this topic today, Nikhil. How are you?
Yeah, we have a lot of energy on this one. I am doing well, and I have a lot on my mind on this topic, so I can't wait to get into it. Um, and Shankar, as you alluded to, this is a big and fun topic today as we think about education and profession. And as you know, it's one of the biggest driving forces between any conversation you have with other generations in our community, right? At least in my experience.
Yeah.
It's always, what are you doing? What are you studying when you think of parental or people in my parents' generation or grandparents' generation? And I think you and I are in an interesting moment right now because we are both currently building out new and emerging identities, right, as coaches. So we thought it'd be a good time to look back at our trajectory and education choices and career choices for ourselves, but also for what it means in our community.
Yeah. And, I have to recognize that one of the most dreaded questions for a high school student is, what do you want to do in your life? And have you written your college essays? Right.
Right.
And in all social gatherings that involve Indians and I'm sure South Asians in general, maybe all communities. Um, I think a lot of the younger people kind of slink away and skulk around because they don't want to be nabbed down and prodded with these questions, right? And it probably never stops. I mean, even as you grow older, it's like, okay, you finished your degree, now what next? Or have you finished grad school, like what next? Or when are you going to write your dissertation? Or you're not done
Right.
yet? So, with a nod to our younger listeners and parents who are trying to delicately navigate those questions, we're going to talk about how our educational trajectories evolved, your and mine, Nikhil, to begin with, and then what choices we had and how those choices influenced our careers, which have also evolved, and what differences we observe in our experiences across our generations. And maybe, we might be able to figure out what principles are at work that we might deduce in understanding those changes for future generations. So, with that, what do you think, Nikhil?
Yeah, that sounds wonderful to me. Because it is such a present force in our lives and in our conversations with other generations. I think this is going to be a really rich discussion. So, Shankar, let me ask you, what was your educational and professional trajectory?
Oh, that's a big one. So, I think I'd probably like to start off with how I was brought up and what I absorbed from that upbringing about education. Because, it's one thing is the milieu that you're brought up in, but also, what you select, right? We don't all pick up the same thing from the same milieu. And also how it's changed. I'd say that my thinking has evolved in two ways. One is recognizing that not everyone thinks like me. Well, surprise, right? And two, that there are many legitimate and reasonable ways to view education, which are different and productive. And also, and I think this might be a big one for parents, is letting go of one's perception of education,
Mm,
so that we allow the younger generation to have a different view of it,
right.
right? And I think for that, many people don't maybe reflect on what does education mean to them at all. What is
Hmm.
the purpose of education, right? And when I was growing up, grew up in a Hindu family, and for us, there was a lot of emphasis on education and learning as being sacred. It's a
Mm,
sacred endeavor, right? And as Saraswati is the goddess of learning. So you prayed, and prayer and learning were sort of close to each other, right? Learning was an act of, in some sense, a prayerful act. And when I went to school, we were taught these verses. I'll share some of them with you if you don't mind.
yeah, please.
Talking about learning itself, right? So we really had a concept of learning given down to us. And one of them, so in Sanskrit, it's Vidya. Vidya is learning. And so one of them went, Vidya dadati vinayam vinayat yati patratam patratva dhanam apnoti dhanat dharmam tadassukam. So what this verse says is, through learning, you become humble. You learn humility. Uh,
Mm,
uh, from humility, you get competence, Patratam. You become competent at something. And then through that competence, you earn money, wealth. And through charity coming from that wealth, you get happiness.
mm.
Okay.
So let me just see if I can read that back. You said
Right.
through learning, you get humility.
Mm-hmm.
Through humility, you get competence.
Mm-hmm.
Through competence, you get money. And then through money, you get happiness.
Through money, you and the charity that comes from that wealth, the charity that you
Okay.
do from that wealth gives you happiness.
So how you give back to, let's say, your
Right.
community is what brings you happiness.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
that's beautiful.
Yeah. So that was one thing that was drilled into us. We learned it, we had to recite it, and it gets into your thinking, right, at some
Yeah.
level. Right. Then the other one we learned was extolling the sort of importance of language. This is a bit of a longer one, or not language, of learning. So it goes Vidya nama narasya rupam adhikam prachanna guptam dhanam Vidya bhogakari yashaha sukhakari Vidya gurunam guruhu Vidya bandhuhu videsha gamane Vidya param daivatam Vidya rajasu pujita natu dhanam Vidya vihina pashuhu. Okay,
Mm,
it's a long one. So it basically says that um, uh, it's the Vidya is like learning is the hidden treasure inside us.
mm,
Okay, it is the one that actually gives us happiness. It gives us enjoyment, learning, um, and it gives you fame, all right, comfort, and it is the teacher of all teachers.
mm,
Learning in an abstract sense, um, and, and it's your friend when you go abroad. When you travel to foreign lands, learning is your friend.
mm,
Um, and how does it go? It's the one that is worshipped by kings, right? Not wealth. And the one who is without learning is an animal.
mm.
Okay. So, for better or for worse, these very idealistic sort of views shaped my early, relationship to learning and education. And, it sort of resonated a lot with learning for the sake of learning
Right.
and, the life of the mind and all that. No, I'll counter that with saying I my thinking has been tempered with a lot more practicality more recently, and I
Mm.
think that's good. I don't think I wouldn't encourage anyone to only think this way. I think it has severe limitations, right?
Which the part about learning for the sake of learning?
Yeah, and sort of like I would caution against being too idealistic, and maybe that was my life
Mm,
experience. Because I think the idealism is great, but the reality that I experience as a professor in the US teaching was in sharp contrast to this, right?
mm.
And I had to understand that there are diverse approaches to education,
Right.
uh,
Right.
and to some extent, this was in a sense, a privileged way to look at education because my education was very, very, very cheap,
Mm,
inexpensive, and I got a very, very high quality education because of the wisdom of the powers that be in the Indian government to institute these top class institutions, and basically the the munificence of the Indian taxpayer,
mm.
right? And I think a lot of people who got that education don't realize that if we were to actually cost that education in today's terms, none of us would have been able to afford it. We got
Right.
right.
Yeah.
And so after coming here, I've started to open my eyes as I became a teacher, a professor, that look, education is a means to livelihood for some people.
Mhm.
It's an important for social mobility for some people. If some people need to get educated, just get out of a bad neighborhood or a difficult family situation, right? So education is not only this rosy, wonderful, uh, high-minded thing, but it's many, many different things. And maybe my own understanding of that changed
Right.
as I started to teach different students and recognize just what different things they were coming to get educated for. Right.
Yeah. That's very big-hearted of you, I think, to see, the nuances and intricacies of education and how it is a tool. it's kind of in some of those verses you mentioned, it is a tool for potentially
That's
economic liberation.
that's true. That's
And
true.
for some people,
Yeah.
that might be the primary driving force to get out of a
Yeah.
certain economic situation or neighborhood or whatever it might be.
Right. Right. Yeah, you're right. It's there, and maybe I just didn't see it, and I see it more in its fullness after all these
Yeah.
years. Right. How about
And did
you?
you
Tell
learn
me.
that from, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just curious. What other reactions, like maybe your relationship to the purpose of education as you were growing up?
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about my family history and
Yeah.
education,
Yeah.
because like you said, it's so deeply ingrained and rooted within the cultural thinking, right? Education is kind of the driving force and kind of the most important force in terms of shaping a young South Asian life or a young Indian kid's life growing up in the 90s. My parents would always talk about how important it was and about doing well. My dad would say, there's two things that I will not cap you on in terms of expenses, of course, within reason, and that's food and education. And so I'm willing to do whatever I can to make those two things happen for you. It's on the same level as nourishment,
Right. Yeah.
in the way my dad looked at it. But just to rewind a little bit, um, the goal of education is to get a good job. I think that was kind of the through line over generations, and to provide for yourself, provide for your family, hopefully build generational wealth. Um, and I think what's so fascinating about it, what's changing a little bit, is the influence of family and parents on your educational and career choices. So if you look at my grandfather on my dad's side, um, you go through the schooling system, and he had a choice between joining in agriculture or joining as an engineer. Um, and he went to a couple of village elders and asked them for advice. And they said, well, India is all about agriculture. There's farmland everywhere. You should do agriculture. I think we can say with hindsight today, engineering might have been the more lucrative pick or the one with more upside, career upside, but he became a government official in the agriculture space and was able to do well by himself and his family, but he chose based on what these elders told him. Fast forward 20, 30 years. My dad is coming out of high school, picking his career, brilliant student, and he has a choice between computer science and medicine. And as you and I think, know, um, when you think about the hierarchy of career choices
Right.
in Indian society, and I think probably South Asian society more generally, there's doctor at the top,
Yeah.
there's engineer second, and then lawyer as well, somewhere in that strata,
Right.
and then
Right.
everything else,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
it's so clear that that is the hierarchy.
Right.
So my dad had a choice between medicine and computer science. He wanted to do computer science. That's what his heart was telling him to do. My grandfather, his dad said, "Hey, I think you should do medicine. It's higher on this in this hierarchy, and I think it's a better life for you." And my dad accepted that, and he said, "Yes, I'll do medicine." He accepted it as his own choice, even though his dad was the one telling him to do it, and has become a doctor in his career and has done quite well for himself.
Right.
So then I think about my generation, and I feel like I'm the first generation to have real autonomy in this choice, right? In college, I was debating what to do. I was studying pre-med for a time, but ultimately realized I don't think I liked biology enough to pursue medicine in all of its rigor and to be able to give the best quality care for patients. So I pivoted, and I had a conversation with my parents about doing something else. And I ultimately picked economics and computer science. And I dabbled a little bit in math as well. But my dad would tell me, I was nervous what my parents would say, right? Because medicine's the dream,
Yeah.
traditionally speaking.
Right.
And my parents were understanding, and they said, as long as you're building some type of technical skill that you can use
Mhm.
and you're going to go chase your career, go for it. And for
Right.
them, computer science filled that niche.
Mhm.
So, anyways, when I think about education, I just think about the generations deciding, among my grandfather, my father, and I. And this is not to ignore my mother's side at all, but I think my mom came from a family with more business-minded people, and their educational
Right.
choices looked a little bit different. So the
Right.
the lineage on this side is just a little bit clearer for me to compare in terms of
Right.
like A or B.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I'm curious what comes up for you as I say that.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting observation over the generations, how the influence of family thinking and family advice actually weigh in on, individual choices. Right.
Right.
And I think I want to give a little different angle to that, which is also how choices for me growing up in India were constrained by different factors.
Hmm.
Right. Um, so, like you said, the career paths were very clearly defined, pretty much, right? Or at least sort of the safe career paths, right?
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to actually be a journalist as I was growing up. Yeah,
Okay.
I felt I had a lot of facility with the language, English language, and I thought that my dream was to write a lot, be read, things like that. But then when I kind of floated that around, I think pretty much not just my parents, my fellow students thought I was out of my mind, or like, are you nuts? You're going to be a starving journalist or something like that, or and it was not just my parents, just the kind of entire community we interacted with felt that this would be a sort of unsafe choice. And and growing up, like in high school, we had, I think, there were different streams. You kind of branched off. There was and it was once you made that choice, you were pretty stuck in those lanes. So, I
Right.
think 10th grade, you had like this art stream, a commerce stream, and what was called the PCMB, physics, chemistry, maths, and then you had biology or technical drawing. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, and what is so interesting is today a lot of people think I have a lot of artistic talent in different things like music or things like that. But back then, I was considered like zero in arts
Hmm.
because we were judged on some drawing and I was not good at it by their standards. But sort of the notions of those standards are so rigid, I felt, um, that I just wrote myself off from the art stream. I said, nah, I don't know anything about art. I don't have this aptitude or skill. Commerce didn't interest me. I felt like very dry number crunching. I don't want to do this.
Uh-huh.
And then, so it was elimination for me. And then we had biology. So if I chose the biology stream, I had to do dissection. And we'd done a little bit of cockroach and frog, and it was going to turn my stomach.
You were
So again,
out.
I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, I said no. And that's a pretty, like today, somebody would say, well, you don't have to do that to be in the medical field, right? Quite honestly, not everyone has to go and dissect a frog in order to be in the medical profession. There's such a variety of choices. But at that time, that's how it was.
Hmm.
So I couldn't stomach it. So I took technical drawing, and my sister had taken it. And so I was kind of, there's also that you tend to follow what others have done. And so I went into that, and then I got into engineering. And it was a very, so life as I remember it, then people were preparing earlier and earlier for these competitive exams, like the joint entrance exam for the IITs and stuff like that. And then you still had to do your regular schoolwork, right? And I think I didn't do terribly well in my. I mean, I did well by most standards, but when we're saying terribly well there, the cutoffs were more like 95% or higher, right?
Mm.
In order to get into so-called the reputed colleges for science and even engineering. And there was a lot of quotas. They would check which state you were from and all kinds of things. So it was not like an open system.
Right.
I remember one of my friends went to another state to study because the out of state quota was higher for him.
Hmm.
um, and so all kinds of shenanigans. But luckily, I somehow got into got in the IIT competitive exam, and so then I went straight into that. And everybody was like, "Oh, this is so fantastic!" I thought it was a complete fluke and a miracle. I have no clue how I passed that exam.
Hmm.
I was convinced I'd failed it when I came out. and, and then, of course, my dad said, "Well, you got such a low rank. How did you do so poorly?"
Wow.
Yeah. And I just couldn't explain or convince him that this was the incredibly hardest exam I'd ever taken, and I thought it was a
Yeah.
miracle that I got through, right? So that is kind of our. So it was very competitive. It was very high pressure, and they didn't seem like there was a whole lot of choice. But that was what my education was like.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
you make a great point that if we look at the American education system and the Indian education system, they're completely different.
yeah,
The focus on testing in
right,
India
right.
that determines everything about your future
Yep,
is very different from if you're in America and you're applying for college. Sure, you have SAT scores or ACT scores, but you have transcripts, you have a personal essay, you have
right,
extracurriculars. As I understand it, and Shankar, you can keep me honest, you go through 10th grade, big exam at the end of 10th grade in India. That determines your what they call plus one, plus two, right? 11th and 12th
right,
grade.
right,
Plus two, at the end of plus two, you take a big exam that
right,
determines are you eligible to join a medical school or engineering school or, you know, a law school or something else, arts,
right,
commerce, whatever it is, right?
right.
There's no essay, there's
No,
no extracurricular consideration. And
no.
one of the questions I had in my mind was, what kind of pressure does that put on our kids, right? On the generations going through this, where everything hinges on one or two big exams.
I think it's insane, and I think it's gotten worse. In around the time that I was taking those exams, and now we're talking not only of the school exam but the competitive exams.
Mm.
People used to start preparing for those maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and when I left, it had gotten to the point where people in their 5 years ahead they were putting them into these training
Wow.
programs, coaching programs. In India, coaching is coaching for exams often,
Yeah.
and some of them are residential, so they send them away to a place where they just drill them to
Wow.
to do these to perform well on these exams. I think it puts tremendous pressure. I'm sure there's a lot of mental health issues. There's probably breakdown, nervous breakdown. I'm sure there are sad cases of people taking their lives if they did badly on these exams.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. My mom was actually just telling me a story that's happening in Tamil Nadu right now, where a student in high school, I believe, unfortunately, just took her life as a result of this pressure. And I think what was eye-opening to folks was, this type of phenomenon was happening in colleges, and that was kind of known as a problem. But for it to happen to a high school student, even before college, I think is getting a lot of attention in the current moment.
yeah, and some of it is not just the parents; it's the system
Right.
itself. Right?
Yeah.
Um, I think we can safely say that academic performance is not necessarily a good indicator at all of, say, whatever you may call success in later in life. Um,
Yeah.
Getting a job, doing something useful to society, earning a lucrative, income based on your skills. But that perception is still there that, if you miss this, and then there's all kinds of things of family honor, or, you let your, people down. And I think that's unhealthy.
Yeah. So here's another thing I think we have to talk about in this topic. You take your plus two exam and you join your college, and it's based on merit, right? And the better you do, the more choices you have, and maybe you get into that medical school that is top in your state or in the country. If you don't do well, but your family has money, you can make a donation
Yes.
to offset the lack of merit
Yeah.
and still, in some cases, secure a seat for yourself. And I think it's an interesting feature. And over time, what does this mean, right? It means the wealthy families are able to get their kids into good schools, good
Right.
colleges, good professions, and it propagates the system of, wealthy staying wealthy. And just if you're coming from a poor background, you've got to make it on merit. You don't have that safety net, right?
Right.
I'm curious because you actually lived there and I grew up here. So that's my understanding of it, but curious what you'd say to that.
So that's true. But actually, this may be just my perspective, but I actually felt that you had a better shot at getting a good education based on merit in India than in the US.
Really? Hmm.
Yeah. Um, and the reason being that the absolute cost of education is so high in the US. And it's not that way. India is still a far better education system, in my opinion, because the government puts in money into a lot of education. And the actual cost of education is still vastly more affordable. At least it was very affordable in my time. And I
Hmm.
think it's still within the realm of that at government schools and government colleges and places like that. Whereas in the US, it's far more segregated and far more inaccessible, in my opinion, to people of lesser means.
Hmm.
Because there is no college that I can think of here that gives you an affordable education for you, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think community colleges try to fill in uh, somewhat, right? But education is still very expensive in here. I mean, just think of, uh, it's like buying a house, right? If you send your kid to school, and I don't think, I may be wrong, but I don't think it's quite that much in India.
Hmm.
Even if you pay for your kid to go to a private college and you buy the seat through donation, I don't know, but I think it's not quite the same.
Right.
Maybe our listeners will weigh in and tell me if I'm
Yeah,
wrong.
exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
As we've said
right,
before, we have two perspectives out of
right,
several million or billion. So
right. Yeah.
it is good to hear from others.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The cost of an undergraduate education in this country and the increasing price tag, and also your observation coming as a professor who works in that system, I think is, you know, you're someone who works in that space and knows a lot about the financial costs and the value
Yeah,
coming out of it. So I definitely take what you say with a lot of weight in some ways, right? Because you're close to that
yeah,
world.
right. Yeah, and the other aspect is more the curriculum itself. Like we had a very highly structured curriculum. There were few electives. Everyone takes the same classes at the same time, and that has a benefit and a cost, I think. And the benefit is you're all calibrated. You can talk to your peers through all right from high school onwards. All
Mhm.
your people in your section are taking the same classes at the same time, and so you can share a lot. And also, it was a lot more. It was also competitive. Not all of it was unhealthy. Some of it was like, hey, I want to do better, and I'm comparing myself to my peers. I find that a lot less in the US.
Mm,
In the US, your educational journey is highly personal. Nobody wants to compare against how somebody else did in class. Did I get this? Did I understand this right? Did I do well on this test? Etc. Etc. It's highly, highly personal, and it's highly unstructured, and it's highly non-synchronized in the sense you may be in high school, but your schedule may be completely different from that of your friend who's in the same class.
right.
That's unthinkable, at least in the Indian education system that I grew up in.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a great point.
Mhm.
I also, in middle school, I did my schooling here in the US, but I was friends with this Indian group. And so it's funny because what you say, this idea of you run your own race,
Right.
right? Which I really like here in the US and I think opens us up to more creativity and freedom in what we choose.
Mhm.
But in this middle school context in particular, all of these Indian kids that I was hanging out with,
Right.
we would compare to one another.
Yeah.
What did you get on the test? Who was the
Yeah.
top? Like who
Right.
how are we in this ladder of
Oh.
educational performance? And to be honest, it was really bad for me. It was, I mean, it helped me in the sense that it upped my game in a ways. And I was like,
Yeah.
I want to study better. I want to do
Right.
well. And it helped me in that sense. But it was so bad for my mental health too.
Mm.
And so it was funny to get this quasi Indian
Yeah.
pod
Experience.
within the
Right.
American system
Right.
and to think about how it did help me, but there was a cost associated with it.
I think that's a good point. So I think there is something. I think healthy competition is good because when we look at say national average scores on math, reading, and we compare the US to the world, the US is always behind, very seriously behind,
Right.
right? Um, but at the same time, So I think there is an opportunity to bring in a little bit of healthy competition. Um, but I completely agree with you that if it goes beyond a point, it becomes really unhealthy. And you need a lot of support. You need a lot of space for individual growth and creativity. But look, the truth of the matter is that when American graduates go out, they are going to compete in the world with a
Right.
global workforce.
Right.
And so then you also don't want to disadvantage your products of education so seriously that they're completely out of touch with where the world's at.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's also interesting to look at innovation, right?
right.
How many American companies, your Apples, your Googles, your Amazons, your Facebooks
Mhm.
come about, and a point you were making earlier, how much does academic success matter in your life
Right,
ultimately?
right,
Um and how free are you to choose what you even do, right? It was another kind of theme that we talked about earlier.
right.
And one thing that I've been thinking about is, are we really teaching the right things? So I've been reading about this new book that's coming out by Arthur Brooks, who is a professor at Harvard on happiness, as well as Oprah. So he, and we all know Oprah, right? So they talk about happiness and some of the neuroscience behind happiness, and a lot of what they look at, I will try to summarize the key findings, but the idea is, if you want to be happy over the course of your life, you have to invest in many different buckets,
Mhm.
spanning from family connections, friendships, some professional work that drives your purpose, something spiritual or something that's greater than yourself. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious, but something greater than yourself. And ultimately, this overview of relationships being quite important within those buckets. I may be missing one or two of their things, but if that's what's important,
Mhm.
why would we not teach that in a middle school classroom, in a high school classroom? And how do we, like, that's what I hope to give to the next generation in a ways. Because the question I kind of want to ask you is, how do we help? What would you tell a high school student coming up right now
Mhm.
under the backdrop of increasing academic pressure, of the fact that like now even high schoolers have to have internships here, right? Like
Right,
I had an internship in college, one or two internships, but now it's expected in high school. The pace is getting, you have to start earlier seemingly.
right, right.
And how do we put it in this context where at the end of the day, academic success or what you choose is one piece of it, but the elements of a good life are so much deeper and more varied than just that.
It's a fantastic observation, and I'm completely with you on that. If I remember, even in India, and this probably goes back many cultures, a lot of people have thought about this. There used to be the Shanti Niketan kind of school
Hmm.
where they would sort of teach more in nature and learn more through the natural environment and spark your curiosity, rather than have the whole, like um, an economy of scale approach to education where you churn people through a mill, right? And I think what you're saying is absolutely spot on, that ultimately what makes us happy um, is not just that degree or the large number of hours you put into, or even the job that you get thereafter, or even the money that you make from that. Because, simple thing like how you manage your relationships is probably a much larger indicator of your mental happiness than anything
Right.
else, right? And so, why don't we teach life skills or relationship skills or there are courses like that now. The Northwestern and Yale and others have
Yeah.
courses on things like that, which is, I think, a very welcome addition. And Arthur Brooks, by the way, yeah, he's highly regarded and has written some very nice, insightful things. So you're right. Education, if you go back and ask yourself, um, and to give you a twist on the two shlokams I read to you, in our tradition, we also have this idea of what's called paravidya and aparavidya. So the knowledge of the beyond. So knowledge itself has two aspects. There's the knowledge of the beyond and the knowledge of the lower knowledge, which is the sciences and all that, you know, of the world
Hmm.
that we see through our senses. And so cultivating, so one is meant to build you up to then access the other. So you learn
Mm.
the lower knowledge to then gain the higher knowledge. And yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it would be a great idea to revamp our education system to make it serve the needs of human beings better than it does right now. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because I'm figuring some of this out in my early 30s by reading books and listening to podcasts completely voluntarily.
Right.
And I'm so glad to be happening upon this information so I can better my life going forward. But imagine if I had come across this in a high school course or a college
Mhm.
course, and if that was more available, more readily available in that space,
Right.
what could I have done with my past 10 years that might have helped me in these regards? So I think it's so easy to get caught in running that race and going faster, doing the internship sooner, right? Getting better
I
grades
know.
on the SAT. And some of those things are important, no doubt. But
Right.
if we don't know how to handle that pressure and stress, and if we don't know that ultimately your career is one piece, an important piece, but one piece of a larger fulfilled life,
Right.
then we hang ourselves out to dry.
Right. And perhaps also understanding that education doesn't happen only in the classroom. I mean, that's another useful thing to teach our younger generation that
Yeah.
you can get educated. It happens at home. It happens at the short work you may take. It happens in the gym. It happens, through so many other ways, right? Extracurricular activities.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Great point. Yeah. I played tennis for 4 years in high school.
Mhm.
And the people on my team, my coach, what I learned competing week in, week out, I think I may have learned more in those 4 years from tennis, ultimately, for about
Mhm.
who I am and what I want out of life and how I approach life than in the classroom, even, right?
Right.
Or maybe
Right.
just as much as I learned in the classroom. It was invaluable. I think about those
Mhm.
moments all the time.
And there, I think the US educational approach wins out, quite honestly, because I've noticed that a far more well rounded exposure to sports and music and the arts. In India, it was always considered, at least the way where I grew up, and it was a luxury or it was something that took away time from academics, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I had interest in dramatics and music, but it was always somehow seen as taking time away from the very important study of academic.
Right. You
Yeah.
just triggered a memory for me where I studied abroad in Singapore for a year in college,
Uh,
which is an incredible experience. But some of the features of the American system and the Asian system came to play. And when I was in Singapore, I was playing frisbee with a group of international friends and picked up my love for frisbee. But I remember we were sitting in the dining hall and some of the local students came by and I was saying to them, "Hey, we're going to go play frisbee after this. Do you want to come join us?" And the look on their faces of, "Are you kidding? Like we have tests to study for, we have stuff to do. Why would we go do this trivial, mundane thing of playing frisbee?" And I went to play frisbee. I had a ton of fun and it was a great time. But it's that moment, that stark realization that you live in two different worlds or come from two different worldviews was very
right,
clear in that moment.
right. I'm really glad you did that because I'm not sure that uh, even there yet. I mean,
Mm,
if I'm given an exam to study for, I probably study, and it's taken me time to understand that you there are there's a value to relaxation. There's a value
yeah.
to getting into the zone, actually,
Right. Yeah.
and yeah,
Yeah. That
that's
makes sense.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Shifting a bit to career. So, do you want to talk a little bit about moving from education to career choice, Nikhil?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot more freedom to do so here in the US, and it's a lot less structured, which is good and bad. Um, for me, I ended up joining the consulting field coming out of school, although I was trained in computer science and economics. And I learned a lot doing a lot of kind of general consulting and am now shifting my career into a bit of the coaching space. And one reflection I'm having is this idea of the career lattice versus the career ladder, right? Typically in the past. And also this idea, actually, I should say, of career choice versus career choices in the past for not just in India, but previous generations. You make a choice, you go through a career, you climb the ladder as high as you want to go. But now there are a lot more shifts in career, and it's not just climbing the ladder, it's the lattice. What diagonal moves or lateral moves might you be making over the course of a 40-year career? So that's where I am at. Even in my career, I've made some different shifts within the consulting space and now hopefully the coaching space.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for that freedom and autonomy. Um, and I think that's an interesting thing to square away with the traditional views of education and career and the hierarchy we talked about at the beginning, right? In South Asian thinking of doctor, lawyer, engineer, everything
Right.
else. When you live, it's a different world now.
Right.
How about you, Shankar?
So thanks for introducing me to the word career lattice. That's really nice. It makes a lot of sense, but
Yeah.
yeah, now that I think about it. Um, but you're right. My dad's generation, I think people typically joined a company and you're sort of the institution man, right? You worked your way up that ladder. And often they would just retire at the same company that they joined. They're not unheard of. Um, and there was a huge sense of loyalty to the institution and the institution paying you back or taking care of you, whether it be a corporate or a government institution. And I think obviously that was probably a myth even in that generation. I think that ship had already sailed, you
Mm,
know. But I see a trend that people spend shorter and shorter times in every job as we go along, and I just think that's just the way things are nowadays. In my own career choice, one thing I wanted to bring up was it was significantly influenced and constrained by the fact that I had emigrated to another country, and my visa status didn't allow me to apply for many jobs that I might even have been interested in or qualified for.
mm,
So that actually severely, my choice to continue here and continue my career here pretty much meant that the regular career services was completely useless to me at the university.
oh, well.
Uh, every job required you to have permanent residence or citizenship. And so there was not even a point applying. Nobody would even look at your resume. And that was hard. I mean, you know, and then it also meant that uh, you sort of had to take what you got pretty much. And I was lucky enough that I got some good offers and choices. But I think what I'm experiencing now with a lot of joy is a sort of blue sky open thing where I want to write what I would like in the future of my career. And it's a very happy place to be looking at things from, right?
Yeah.
And I, I probably one thing I'd like to share with other listeners who may be older is, it's never too late to try something new. Mm. And that's something that I've learned from the American system. I do want to surface another feeling though, which is I don't know if you watched some of this psychological stuff on the paradox of choice,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? But too much choice actually paralyzes us,
Yeah.
um, and I sometimes wonder whether a lot of the challenges that um, students and parents here, parents of those students in the US face arises from that. And sort of what I would like to offer is that I think the choice that America offers is good for some type of individuals who may be highly motivated, self starters who have a lot of direction, right? And I think we need a sort of layered system where somebody who doesn't want that much choice has a way to also progress in a more structured curriculum, maybe, and that might serve the needs of different people in society better, rather than everyone being given this and some people being paralyzed by it. That's just a thought.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that idea. And thanks for sharing that reflection, especially around the constraining of choices given your immigration status. It's not something I think about or interact with regularly. So that's a good reminder to me of just, what immigrants go through. And if you don't have, I don't know, if you're not born here or don't have an American citizenship or something, it can change the whole game.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, on the positive side, um, I still had some choices, and it would be nice, I think, going forward if we can. And I think there is some move to open them up, but that sort of waxes and wanes with the political whims of the administration, and
Sure. Yeah.
that's sitting right now. Um, but another thing I want to see is that we talked about this a little bit in the good life, is that the newer generation, the younger generation, has an opportunity to somehow rise higher in the Maslow pyramid. So they're less concerned about, just a lucrative career for the sake of, you know, keeping, body and soul together, or whatever, how you want to put it. Um, and I think that's why they're entering more into the arts, into entertainment, into, you know, environmental issues and things that really they feel are important to society, which is really nice, right? They're able to open their lens beyond just their individual well-being and
Yeah.
think more on a societal level. I think that's really nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have this conversation with my dad sometimes where we talk about, you know, my parents coming here to the US and creating these incredible opportunities that they would have just given anything for, right, in their day, and what they would do with my opportunity versus what I do with my opportunity. And some of the intellectual debate around, why not run super hard right now for the next 20 years, secure my economic future, my family's economic future, and then have the freedom to retire early or do whatever I want to do. That's something very much on my dad's mind and something he is drawn to.
Mhm.
But for me, I would rather work through, like, I'm happy to work till I'm 65, do the kind of career path, traditional kind of career path, recognizing there will be career shifts in there, and have a more balanced, happier life than running the fast race. And like you said, contribute hopefully back to my community, back to the world in a meaningful way. So that I see those generational differences even in how an older generation and my generation looks at the career choices we're making.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think there's a value. There's a wisdom and foresight in one, and there's also the wisdom of you know the here now is important too, and sort of how we build a happy life is through happy moments. Every moment is what adds up, right? And and we also never know when that end will come. So
Right.
there's a value. There's a good sense to that also. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Anything else on your mind around education or career?
I think we covered a lot, but I mean, I'm sure there's a lot we didn't cover. It's
Yeah.
probably a small, I was thinking about the gig economy and work from home and how all
Yeah.
those things are changing careers and life for the newer generation, but also the principles that remain the same, right? Like, how do you view education? What do you view as the purpose of education? What do you view as the purpose of your life? And what do you see your career itself as? Is it what intersection of your passion, of your aptitude, of your necessity to gain something, gainful compensation and return for what you do, and how you're able to contribute to society? It's some complex mix of all that, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And, if we think about final takeaways, I'd be curious to hear what you think too. But a couple things I'm taking away. Number one, regardless of which system you're in, American or Indian, the success granted to you by educational and career accolades, let's say, does not guarantee happiness. And we really each have to do the work of finding what is happiness for ourselves. No matter what you're hearing from the American system, the Indian system, you have to be on your own path, and education career is one big piece of that, but it's not the end all be all. And then number two, I'm going to think about the point you made around the American system, the Indian system, and how the American system has become so expensive in the secondary education that it's inefficient to some extent, and it's really prohibitive for a lot of people to run that race.
Right.
And kind of giving that more credence, I think I've almost become desensitized to the price tags of colleges these days, but comparing across societies, it's really quite exorbitant.
Right. Right. Yeah. Final takeaways. Yeah, you're right. I think education is just a formalized way of learning, right? But learning is a lifelong thing, and learning gives us happiness. Learning gives us enjoyment in its own way, right? And so sometimes I think education can kill the joy in learning, and that's not a good educational
Yeah,
system, right?
right.
Um, and career again is a means to get compensated and to also get recognized for your contributions, and both those are very important, undoubtedly. But they're also pieces of the puzzle to happiness, but they are not the defining features of being happy and leading a full life. So I completely agree with you. I think keeping that in mind and having our younger generation reflect on that larger picture, and then try to find the best path forward in whatever system you are. I think there's pluses and minuses to both, to all systems. And maybe from an educational system perspective, there's something that each can learn from the other. I think the American can learn from the Indian can learn from the American. And so there's a lot of value there. And basically to not look back and have regrets, but forge forward with where you're at. That's what I would say.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm realizing maybe we can come back to some of these topics, like you said, around the gig economy, around paradox of choice in career, and just building a happy life that includes a career and is considerate or factors in a career, but is broader than that. I think that would be, I'm learning how to do that or trying to do that. So I would
Yeah.
appreciate your help with it.
Absolutely. That which you talked about relationships and human connection and all that is fantastic. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Well, wonderful. It'll be great to hear from our listeners um, on this topic as well. So, to our dear listeners, you can reach out to us on our Instagram page, Chai Across Generations, or our email at chaiacrossgenerations@gmail.com.
As always, subscribe to our podcast. Please leave us a rating or review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This helps new people find our show, and we want to thank you all for listening.
See you all next time.